In the heart of Fairhaven, a quiet town with deep roots and lingering divides, Police Chief Marcus Jordan is a man determined to bridge the gaps that have kept his community apart for years. Respected for his calm demeanor and unwavering dedication, Marcus has made it his mission to create a place where everyone belongs. But change doesn't come easily, and when a heated confrontation at the farmers' market exposes old prejudices, Marcus finds himself at the center of a storm that threatens to unravel the fragile progress he's worked so hard to build. As the town grapples with its past and uncertain future, Marcus faces challenges that test his resilience, his patience, and his belief in the power of hope. Through moments of tension, unexpected kindness, and profound transformation, Marcus leads Fairhaven on a journey of healing and growth. But will the seeds of unity he's planted take root, or will resistance pull the town back into its divisions? Join us for a story of courage, perseverance, and the unshakable belief that even the smallest acts of kindness can spark a movement. And as we step into Fairhaven's journey, we invite you to reflect on your own role in building a better world. The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays over the bustling streets of East Fairhaven. This part of town, with its small shops and family-run businesses, was alive with the chatter of shoppers and the clinking of cash registers. The farmers' market was the heart of it all, vibrant with colors from rows of fresh fruits and vegetables. Among the crowd walked Marcus Jordan, the town's police chief, dressed sharply in his uniform, the gold badge on his chest gleaming under the sunlight. Marcus moved through the market with purpose, but also with a sense of familiarity. He greeted people warmly, exchanging nods and brief conversations. Many locals knew him, respected him, even admired his steady presence and the way he worked tirelessly to keep the peace in their small town. But Marcus knew respect could be fragile in Fairhaven. Not everyone welcomed him with open arms, and his skin color often carried assumptions he had spent years trying to dispel. As he reached a fruit stand, Marcus paused, eyeing a bag of oranges. His week had been relentless, and this moment of normalcy felt like a rare reprieve. He was about to place the bag into his cart when a voice interrupted him. "You people do not belong here." The voice cut sharply through the hum of the market. Marcus froze. The voice belonged to an elderly woman standing nearby, her silver hair pinned neatly, her cardigan buttoned up tight. She clutched a bag of apples with one hand while pointing at him with the other. Her expression was stern, her voice loud enough to draw attention. The surrounding shoppers paused. Conversations trailed off, and the rhythmic noise of the market came to a halt. Marcus turned slowly to face her. His calm brown eyes met her steely glare. "Excuse me?" Marcus said evenly, his voice steady despite the sting of her words. "You heard me," she continued undeterred. "This town was better before people like you came in, changing everything, making it unsafe." Her words were a slap against the warmth Marcus had been feeling just moments before. Around them, people exchanged uneasy glances. Some shoppers stepped away, pretending not to hear. Others lingered, their curiosity holding them in place. Marcus inhaled deeply, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. This was not the first time he had faced such venom, but it still hit like a fresh wound each time. In moments like this, he could hear his father's voice in his mind. "Strength is how you respond, not how you react." He straightened his posture, his hand still resting on the basket in his cart. "Ma'am," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I am the police chief of this town. Where I come from is right here. I live here. I work here. And I protect this community, including you." The woman scoffed, clutching her apples closer to her chest. "You do not belong," she repeated, her voice unwavering. Marcus glanced around. Eyes were on him now, young mothers, elderly couples, teenagers. He knew that whatever he said next would not just define this moment, but might also leave a lasting impression on everyone watching. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. "I hear you," he said slowly, his voice measured. "But let us talk about what makes you feel this way. Because I believe there is room in this town for all of us, no matter where we are from or how we look." The woman's eyes narrowed further, her lips pressing into a thin line. But she said nothing. The crowd, still hushed, seemed to be holding its collective breath. That night, Marcus sat in his small but well-kept house on the edge of town. The house had been his parents' home, and it held memories that grounded him. Photographs lined the walls. His mother in her nurse's uniform, his father in his mechanic's overalls, and a younger Marcus posing in his high school football jersey. The house smelled faintly of pine wood and the coffee Marcus had brewed to calm his thoughts after the confrontation. He sat in the living room, staring at an old black-and-white photograph of his parents. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You fight ignorance with dignity, not fists." It had been one of the hardest lessons his father had taught him. As a boy, Marcus had watched his father confront a neighbor who had called him a racial slur. His father had not yelled, had not argued. He had simply stood his ground, spoke with conviction, and walked away with his dignity intact. It was a moment Marcus carried with him, a lesson he had tried to live by ever since. But tonight, the weight of it all felt heavier than usual. Marcus sipped his coffee, staring out the window as the streetlights flickered on. He thought about the faces at the market, the mixture of support, indifference, and silent agreement. He wondered if he had done enough, if his words had reached anyone. The following morning, Marcus arrived at the station earlier than usual. Fairhaven's police department was small, a modest brick building with a staff of 20. Carla Mendoza, his deputy, greeted him at the door. "Morning, Chief," she said, handing him a tablet. "You might want to see this." Marcus took the tablet, his eyes scanning the headline of a local news article. Police chief confronted at farmer's market in racial incident. Beneath it was a photograph of him standing tall, speaking to Mrs. Keller, her expression twisted with anger. He handed the tablet back. "Word travels fast," he muttered. "Social media is buzzing," Carla said, her voice cautious. "Most people are supporting you, but some—" Marcus nodded. He knew what she meant. The voices of support were always loudest at first, but the undercurrent of opposition would soon follow. "That is all right," he said. "Let them talk." "Do you want to make a statement?" Carla asked. "Not yet," Marcus replied. "Words are important, but actions speak louder." As the day progressed, Marcus could feel the undercurrents of the market incident rippling through the town. People at the station spoke in hushed tones, their curiosity palpable. Marcus remained focused, going about his duties with the same quiet determination that had defined his leadership. But the weight of Mrs. Keller's words lingered. They were not just the words of one person. They were the echoes of a lifetime of prejudice. Marcus knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he also knew he had a choice: to let those words define him, or to rise above them. Sitting in his office that afternoon, Marcus looked out at the town he had sworn to protect. He thought about his parents, about the sacrifices they had made to give him a chance at a better life. He thought about the people who had stood silently at the market and those who had whispered in support. And then he thought about Mrs. Keller, her fear and anger laid bare. Marcus knew his next move would be important not just for him, but for the town. He picked up his pen and began drafting a plan, a way to address what had happened and to bring the community together. Because if there was one thing he believed in, it was this: change starts with conversation, and conversation starts with courage. The news of the confrontation at the farmer's market spread like wildfire through Fairhaven. By midweek, it seemed like everyone in town had an opinion about what had happened. The local diner buzzed with whispers over coffee and pancakes, and the town's online forums lit up with heated discussions. Some praised Chief Marcus Jordan for his calm demeanor, calling him a model of professionalism and grace. Others defended Mrs. Keller, claiming she was simply voicing concerns that others were too afraid to express. A few, however, saw the incident as a reflection of a deeper issue, one that had simmered beneath the surface of Fairhaven for years. At the police station, Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing reports from the previous day. His office was modest, with neatly stacked files on one side and framed photographs on the other. Among them was a picture of his graduating class from the police academy. Marcus, one of the few black cadets at the time, stood tall in the center, a proud yet determined look on his face. A knock at the door broke his concentration. Carla Mendoza, his deputy, stepped inside holding a clipboard. Her expression was a mix of concern and curiosity. "Chief," she began, her voice hesitant. People are talking about what happened at the market. A lot of people. Marcus set down the report he had been reading. I figured as much, he said calmly. What are they saying? Carla hesitated before answering. Some are upset with Mrs. Keller, saying her words were out of line. But there are others who, well, let's just say they agree with her. Marcus nodded, his face unreadable. He had expected this. And what about the rest? He asked. Carla gave a small shrug. Most people are just trying to figure out where they stand. It has stirred up a lot of feelings, Chief. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. That's not necessarily a bad thing, he said. Sometimes you have to stir the pot to see what needs to be addressed. Carla hesitated again, then placed the clipboard on his desk. A group of residents is asking for a town meeting. They want to discuss what happened. Openly. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Do they now? Yes, Carla said. It could be an opportunity to clear the air, but it might also turn into a shouting match. Marcus considered her words carefully. A public forum could go either way, constructive or chaotic. But ignoring the issue was not an option. Let's set it up, he said finally. Transparency is important. If people want to talk, we'll give them a space to do it. Carla nodded, a hint of relief in her eyes. I'll make the arrangements. The town meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. Word spread quickly, and by the time Marcus arrived that night, the room was already packed. Rows of folding chairs were filled with residents of all ages, from elderly couples to young parents with toddlers on their laps. A few teens lingered at the back, their curiosity piqued by the buzz around town. Marcus entered the room in his uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The room fell silent as he walked to the front, his presence commanding but calm. He scanned the faces of the crowd, noting the mix of emotions, curiosity, apprehension, and in some cases, quiet hostility. Standing near the back was Mrs. Keller. Her expression was as stern as ever, though Marcus noticed a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white against the faded leather. Marcus stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. Good evening, he began, his deep voice resonating through the room. Thank you all for coming. I understand there's a lot on people's minds, and I want to create a space where we can talk openly and honestly. He paused, letting his words sink in. What happened at the farmer's market last weekend was difficult for many of us. It brought to the surface some feelings and beliefs that have been simmering in our community for a long time. I believe it's time we address them together. A murmur spread through the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus continued, his tone steady but firm. Racism is not a new issue. It's something I've dealt with my entire life, and I know I'm not alone in that. But it's not enough to just acknowledge it exists. We have to be willing to confront it and work through it. From the back, Mrs. Keller's voice cut through the murmurs. And what does that mean for people like me? She asked, her tone sharp. Are we just supposed to accept that everything we've known is changing? All eyes turned to her, the room holding its breath. Marcus met her gaze, his expression calm but serious. Mrs. Keller, he said, addressing her directly. Change can be hard, I won't deny that. But feeling at home doesn't mean making others feel unwelcome. This town belongs to all of us. We can't move forward if we're stuck in the past. Mrs. Keller's face reddened, but she said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable, but Marcus could feel the crowd beginning to lean in, listening. A young mother near the front raised her hand. Chief Jordan, she said, her voice tentative, I've lived here my whole life, and I've seen how much better things have gotten since you became chief. But I've also seen how hard it's been for you. How do you stay so calm? Marcus thought for a moment before answering. It's not always easy, he admitted, but I believe in this town. I believe in the good that exists here, even when it's hard to see. And I believe that kindness and understanding are stronger than hate. The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. Slowly, others began to speak, sharing their thoughts, their fears, and their hopes. Some voiced support for Marcus, while others expressed their frustration with the changes in the town. Through it all, Marcus listened, responding with patience and empathy. By the end of the evening, the room felt lighter, the tension replaced by a sense of possibility. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus caught sight of Mrs. Keller lingering near the door. She hesitated, her expression unreadable, before turning and walking out into the night. Back at home, Marcus sat in his living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet space. He thought about the meeting, about the voices he had heard, and the emotions that had filled the room. It had been messy, but it was a start. Looking at the photograph of his parents on the mantel, Marcus felt a small spark of hope. His father's words came back to him once more. "You fight ignorance with dignity, not fists." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a quiet determination settling over him. The road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to walk it one step, one conversation, one act of kindness at a time. The morning after the town meeting, Marcus Jordan walked into the station with a coffee in hand and a contemplative look on his face. The meeting had gone better than he had anticipated. While not everyone had left with a changed perspective, many residents had voiced thoughts they had long kept to themselves. Marcus knew progress was slow and uneven, but even a small ripple could eventually grow into a wave. The station was quiet when he arrived. Carla Mendoza sat at her desk, typing rapidly on her computer. She looked up as Marcus entered. "Morning, Chief," she said with a smile. Then her face grew more serious. "I wanted to let you know something. Mrs. Keller came by earlier." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Keller? What for?" Carla hesitated. "She did not say much. Just left a note for you." She handed him an envelope, the paper crisp and white with his name written in tight, angular handwriting. Marcus set his coffee down and opened it carefully. Inside was a short message. "Chief Jordan, thank you for your words last night. They gave me a lot to think about. Sincerely, Edith Keller." The note was simple, but it surprised Marcus. He read it twice, considering what it might mean. Her tone had softened from the sharpness he'd experienced at the farmer's market. But was it an olive branch or just a passing thought? "Looks like you might have gotten through to her," Carla said, watching his reaction. "Maybe," Marcus replied, tucking the note into his pocket. "Or maybe she is testing the waters." The day unfolded with routine police work reports of minor property damage, a few speeding tickets, and a community safety inspection. But the note from Mrs. Keller stayed with Marcus, lingering in his thoughts like a faint echo. He thought back to the meeting, to the moment Mrs. Keller had spoken. The room had been heavy with judgment, but her words had carried something more, fear. It was not just Marcus she was reacting to, it was change itself. Marcus knew that fear well. It had shaped many of his experiences growing up as one of the few black children in Fairhaven. He remembered the unease of being watched too closely in stores, the whispers behind his back when he achieved something others had not expected of him. But he also remembered the people who had shown him unexpected kindness, who had looked past their own fears to see him for who he truly was. That evening, as Marcus walked through his neighborhood, he was reminded of those early lessons in resilience. His modest home stood at the end of a tree-lined street, surrounded by others just like it, small, sturdy, and filled with life. The houses in this part of town were not grand, but they held stories, histories, and families who worked hard for what they had. Marcus stepped onto his porch and sank into an old rocking chair, watching the streetlights flicker on. He let the stillness of the evening wrap around him like a warm blanket. Across the street, his neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, a widow in her 70s, waved at him from her garden. "You look sharp at the meeting last night, Marcus," she called. "You always do when you are speaking the truth." Marcus chuckled softly. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That means a lot." She smiled and returned to her roses, humming a tune that drifted through the evening air. Later that night, as Marcus lay in bed, his thoughts returned to Mrs. Keller. What had caused her to write that note? Was it guilt? Regret? Or something deeper? Marcus had spent years learning to read between the lines, to see the emotions people often try to hide. But this time, he could not be sure. The next morning, his questions were partially answered. Marcus was at the station, reviewing training schedules, when Carla appeared at his door again. "You have a visitor," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "It is Mrs. Keller." Marcus blinked, surprised. "Send her in," he said, setting his work aside. Moments later, Mrs. Keller stepped into the office, clutching her purse tightly. She looked around the room, her sharp eyes taking in the neat desk the commendation plaques on the wall, and the framed photo of Marcus' parents. "Mrs. Keller," Marcus greeted her, rising from his chair. "Please have a seat." She hesitated, but eventually sat down across from him, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Keller cleared her throat. "I wanted to thank you," she began, her voice quieter than Marcus had ever heard it, "for what you said at the meeting. It made me think about some things." Marcus nodded, his expression calm. "I'm glad to hear that. What is on your mind?" She hesitated again, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I have lived in this town my whole life," she said. "It has always been my home, but lately it feels different. I suppose I do not understand the changes, and it makes me uneasy." Marcus listened carefully, noting the vulnerability in her tone. "Change can be difficult," he said gently, "but it is also necessary. This town is growing, evolving. That does not mean we lose what makes it special, it just means we add to it." Mrs. Keller looked up, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, Marcus saw something in her expression that had not been there before: uncertainty. "I suppose I have been stuck in my ways," she admitted. "I did not mean to come across as hateful, but I see now that my words hurt you. And for that, I am sorry." The apology was unexpected, and it took Marcus a moment to respond. "Thank you, Mrs. Keller," he said sincerely. "It takes courage to reflect and admit when we are wrong." She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I do not expect things to change overnight," she said, standing. "But I wanted you to know I am trying." Marcus rose with her, extending his hand. She hesitated before shaking it, her grip firm despite the tremble in her fingers. After Mrs. Keller left, Marcus sat in his office, reflecting on their conversation. He thought of his parents, of the lessons they had taught him about perseverance and grace. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Kindness is not weakness. It is strength." Later that day, Marcus walked through town with a renewed sense of purpose. He stopped at the farmer's market, the site of the confrontation that had started it all. As he picked up a bag of oranges, the vendor, a young man named Eli, smiled at him. "Chief," Eli said, "I was at the meeting the other night. I just wanted to say thanks for what you said. It made me think about how I treat people, too." Marcus smiled, his heart lightened by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Eli," he replied. "It means a lot to hear that." As Marcus walked back home, he realized that change, however slow, was possible. And in those small moments of connection, he saw the beginning of something better for Fairhaven. The days following Mrs. Keller's visit brought a mixture of reactions from the people of Fairhaven. The confrontation at the farmer's market and the subsequent town meeting had stirred deep emotions, and the town was abuzz with conflicting opinions. Conversations spilled into coffee shops, barbershops, and social media. It seemed everyone had something to say. Marcus noticed the ripple effects during his routine patrols. As he walked through downtown, some residents greeted him warmly, while others avoided his gaze altogether. The division was subtle but undeniable, like a fault line just beneath the surface. At the station, Carla entered his office carrying a stack of reports. "Chief," she said, her tone cautious, "I think you should see this." She handed him a printout of an online thread from a local community forum. The title read, "Is Fairhaven changing too much, too fast?" Marcus skimmed the comments. Some were supportive, calling for unity and understanding, but others were harsher, accusing him of pushing an agenda or questioning whether he truly belonged in the town. He set the paper down, sighing deeply. "It's not unexpected," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Change is always uncomfortable." Carla nodded, her expression serious. "True, but it feels like the tension is growing. People are choosing sides." "That's how it starts," Marcus replied. "But division only wins if we let it." Later that afternoon, Marcus attended a meeting with the town council to discuss community initiatives. The atmosphere in the room was tense. Councilwoman Irene Walsh, an outspoken advocate for progress, sat across from Councilman Frank Simmons, who often voiced more traditional views. "The farmers market incident has exposed something we can't ignore," Irene began, her voice steady but firm. "There's an undercurrent of prejudice in our town, and we need to address it head-on." Frank shook his head. With all due respect, Irene, I think you're overreacting. This town isn't perfect, but we don't need to blow one incident out of proportion. People are entitled to their opinions. Irene's eyes narrowed. Not when those opinions demean others or make them feel unwelcome. Marcus listened carefully, his gaze shifting between the two. When the room fell silent, he cleared his throat. "If I may," he began, his voice commanding attention, "this isn't just about one incident. It's about the kind of town we want Fairhaven to be. Ignoring the issue won't make it go away." Frank leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "And what exactly do you suggest we do, Chief? Hold hands and sing songs about unity?" Marcus met his gaze evenly. "No," he said firmly. "I suggest we create opportunities for people to come together, to talk, and to learn from one another. It won't solve everything, but it's a start." The room fell quiet. Irene nodded, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "I think that's a good idea," she said. "We could organize community events like workshops or town hall discussions." Frank looked skeptical, but didn't argue further. The meeting ended with a tentative plan to launch a series of events aimed at fostering dialogue and understanding. That evening, Marcus returned to his neighborhood, his mind heavy with the day's discussions. As he walked down the familiar tree-lined street, he spotted a group of kids playing basketball in a driveway. Their laughter echoed through the crisp evening air, a reminder of the innocence that still existed amidst the tension. One of the kids, a boy named Jamal, waved excitedly when he saw Marcus. "Hey, Chief Jordan, want to shoot some hoops?" he called. Marcus smiled, walking over to join them. He shed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and grabbed the ball. For the next 20 minutes, he played alongside the kids, their joy infectious. By the time he left, his heart felt lighter. When he reached his porch, he found a small envelope tucked into the mailbox. Inside was a note from Mrs. Thompson, his neighbor. It read, "Marcus, I saw what you did at the town meeting. You are doing better than you realize. Keep going." Marcus stood on the porch for a moment, the note in his hand. The gesture, though small, reminded him that kindness often came from unexpected places. The following week, the first of the community events took place at the library. The turnout was modest, but Marcus considered it a success. Residents sat in a circle, sharing stories and perspectives. Mrs. Keller was among them, her demeanor noticeably softer. "I used to think I understood this town," she admitted when it was her turn to speak. "But maybe I've been too focused on holding on to the past. I want to try to do better." Her words were met with a few murmurs of approval, and Marcus felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was progress. After the event, a young man named Andre approached Marcus. He was in his early 20s, with a hesitant but determined expression. "Chief Jordan," he said, "I just wanted to say thank you. My family and I have felt different since we moved here, but seeing you stand up like that, it gives me hope." Marcus shook his hand, his grip firm. "We all belong here, Andre," he said. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." As Marcus walked back to his car, he thought about how far the town still had to go. The division was real, and the work ahead would be long and difficult. But in moments like these, in Mrs. Keller's admission, in Andre's gratitude, he saw the potential for something better. Driving home, Marcus passed the farmer's market. It was quiet now, the stalls empty and the streets deserted. But in his mind, he saw the crowd from that day, the faces of judgment, support, and indifference. He thought about how much had changed since then and how much more could still change. At home, he sat in his rocking chair on the porch, looking out at the darkened street. He thought of his parents, of their unwavering belief in resilience and kindness. His father's words echoed in his mind once more. Kindness is not weakness. It is strength. Marcus smiled faintly, the note from Mrs. Thompson still tucked into his pocket. He didn't know what the future held for Fairhaven, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't stop fighting for it. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Fairhaven's cozy local cafe, the Daily Brew. The air was filled with the rich aroma of coffee beans and the soft murmur of conversation. Marcus Jordan sat at a corner table, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. His usual calm demeanor masked the exhaustion from the previous weeks, but his mind was already turning over the next steps. The first community event had been a cautious success, but Marcus knew one meeting would not heal years of tension. If Fairhaven was to move forward, the effort needed to be continuous. That morning, he had agreed to meet with Irene Walsh, the town councilwoman who had supported the community workshops, to discuss expanding the initiative. Irene arrived a few minutes later, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She was in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that Marcus had always respected. She slid into the seat across from him, setting down a notebook and pen. "Morning, Chief," she said, flashing him a quick smile. "Thanks for making time." "Morning," Marcus replied, offering a polite nod. "I appreciate you coming up with these events. They're giving people a chance to have conversations that we've avoided for too long." Irene opened her notebook, flipping to a page filled with notes and bullet points. "I agree," she said, "but if we're going to keep the momentum, we'll need more involvement. The turnout was decent, but we need more people from different parts of town. Otherwise, we're just preaching to the choir." Marcus took a sip of his coffee, considering her words. She was right. The first event had drawn mainly residents who were already open to the idea of change. To make a real impact, they would need to reach those who felt disconnected or even opposed to the efforts. "Maybe we start small," Marcus suggested. "Neighborhood-specific events. We bring the conversation directly to people instead of asking them to come to us." Irene nodded thoughtfully. "That could work," she said, "and we'll need to involve people who can act as bridges between groups, like you did with Mrs. Keller." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Keller was not exactly a planned success story. "Maybe not," Irene said with a small laugh. "But it worked. She's already talking differently, and people are noticing." The two continued to brainstorm, their ideas flowing freely. As they finalized a rough plan, the door to the cafe jingled, and a familiar face walked in, Mrs. Keller herself. She paused when she saw Marcus, her expression uncertain. After a moment, she walked over, clutching her handbag tightly. "Good morning, Chief Jordan," she said hesitantly, her voice quieter than usual. "Good morning, Mrs. Keller," Marcus replied, gesturing to an empty chair. "Would you like to join us?" She glanced at Irene, then back at Marcus, before nodding. "I suppose I could sit for a moment," she said, lowering herself into the seat. Irene smiled warmly. "It's nice to see you, Mrs. Keller. I've heard you've been attending the community workshops." Mrs. Keller nodded, adjusting her handbag on her lap. "I have. It's been enlightening." She hesitated, then added, "I still don't agree with everything, but I've realized that maybe I don't know as much as I thought." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression encouraging. "That's an important first step," he said. "It takes courage to challenge your own beliefs." Mrs. Keller's lips tightened into a thin smile. "I suppose it does," she admitted. "I've been thinking about something you said at the meeting, about how this town belongs to all of us. I want to believe that's true, but it's hard sometimes. The world feels like it's changing so fast, and I worry about being left behind." Her words carried a vulnerability that Marcus hadn't seen before. He nodded, understanding her fears. "Change can feel overwhelming," he said. "But being part of that change doesn't mean losing who you are. It just means growing alongside it." The three of them talked for a while longer, and by the time Mrs. Keller left, her posture seemed a little less rigid. Irene watched her go, then turned back to Marcus. "You're good at this," she said. "People listen to you because you make them feel heard." Marcus shook his head modestly. "I just try to meet people where they are. It's the only way forward." The cafe meeting gave Marcus a renewed sense of purpose. Over the next few weeks, he and Irene worked tirelessly to set up smaller, neighborhood-focused events. The response was slow at first, but little by little, more residents began to participate. Marcus made it a point to attend every session, listening carefully and sharing his own experiences when it felt right. At one event held at a community park, a young father named Derek stood up to speak. He had moved to Fairhaven with his family a year ago and had often felt out of place. "I'll be honest," Derek said, his voice shaky but sincere. "I wasn't sure about coming tonight. I've always felt like an outsider here. But seeing Chief Jordan stand up for what's right, it made me feel like I could belong." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. These moments reminded him why the work mattered. Not everyone was on board, of course. There were still pockets of resistance, people who dismissed the workshops as unnecessary or accused Marcus of trying to force change. He encountered subtle hostility in some interactions, passive-aggressive comments, icy stares, but he refused to let them derail his efforts. One afternoon, as he walked through the farmer's market, a man approached him with a scowl. "You're stirring up trouble, Chief," the man said gruffly. "Some of us just want things to stay the way they are." Marcus met his gaze calmly. "I understand that change can be hard," he said, "but staying the same isn't always the answer. We have to grow together." The man shook his head and walked away, muttering under his breath. Marcus let him go, knowing he couldn't change every mind, but he could keep planting seeds. As the weeks turned into months, the workshops began to bear fruit. People who had never spoken to each other before started building connections. Conversations that had once seemed impossible became more common. Even Mrs. Keller surprised Marcus by volunteering to help organize one of the events. One evening, as Marcus walked home from the station, he passed a group of teenagers painting a mural on the side of a building. The mural depicted a tree with deep roots and vibrant branches, surrounded by the words, "Together we grow." Marcus paused, watching the young artists at work. A boy noticed him and waved. "Hey, Chief Jordan," he called. "What do you think?" Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "It's perfect," he said. As he continued down the street, he felt a quiet sense of hope. Fairhaven was not perfect, far from it, but it was growing, and growth, Marcus knew, was the first step toward something better. The mural on the building had become a quiet symbol of Fairhaven's slow but undeniable transformation. Over the weeks, more residents began to stop and admire it, their expressions a mix of curiosity and reflection. The vibrant branches of the tree seemed to speak of possibilities yet to come, and the words beneath it, "Together we grow," were becoming a mantra for those who dared to hope. Marcus Jordan passed by the mural often during his patrols, always taking a moment to appreciate its significance. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in a town where tension had once ruled, it was a sign of progress. On a chilly autumn morning, he stopped again, his breath visible in the crisp air. "You like it, huh?" a voice behind him asked. Marcus turned to see Andre, the young man who had approached him after the first workshop. Andre's hands were stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, and he stood with the slight awkwardness of someone unsure if they were welcome. "I do," Marcus said with a smile. "It says a lot about where this town is headed." Andre nodded, his eyes on the mural. "I helped paint it," he said quietly. "It felt good to do something, something that actually makes a difference." Marcus glanced at him, sensing there was more on his mind. "It's a powerful thing, to create something that brings people together," he said. "You should be proud." Andre hesitated, then looked at Marcus. "Do you think it'll last, though? All this progress? Or is it just going to go back to how it was?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of doubt and lived experience. Marcus took a moment to answer. "Change is hard," he admitted, "and it doesn't happen all at once. But every step forward makes it harder to go back. What you're doing here, Andre, is planting seeds. They may take time to grow, but they will." Andre's shoulders relaxed slightly, and a faint smile crossed his face. "I hope you're right," he said. Later that week, Marcus attended another neighborhood workshop, this time in the basement of a local church. The room was filled with folding chairs and the smell of fresh brewed coffee. The turnout was larger than he'd expected, a sign that word was spreading. Mrs. Keller was there, sitting near the back with her usual air of cautious observation. But Marcus noticed something different about her. She no longer seemed defensive or closed off. Instead, she listened intently, her gaze steady and thoughtful. The session began with a story from a young woman named Maria, who spoke about her family's struggles as immigrants. Her voice trembled at times, but she pressed on, sharing the moments of prejudice and kindness that had shaped her experience in Fairhaven. When Maria finished, the room was quiet. Then Mrs. Keller raised her hand, surprising everyone, including Marcus. "I'd like to say something," she began, standing slowly. Her voice was steady but carried a note of vulnerability. "I've lived in this town my whole life, and I'll admit, I haven't always been kind to people who I thought didn't belong. But listening to Maria, It makes me realize how wrong I've been. We're all just trying to find our place, aren't we?" The room erupted into quiet murmurs of agreement. Marcus watched as Maria smiled warmly at Mrs. Keller, a moment of connection bridging the gap between two very different lives. After the workshop, Marcus approached Mrs. Keller as she was putting on her coat. "That took courage," he said, his voice sincere. She glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "It took too long if you ask me," she replied. "But better late than never, I suppose." Marcus nodded. "It's never too late to make a difference. And you're doing that now." For the first time, Mrs. Keller's face softened into a genuine smile. "Thank you, Chief, for not giving up on me, or this town." As the weeks passed, the workshops continued to grow, attracting more residents from all corners of Fairhaven. The conversations were not always easy. There were still moments of tension, anger, and misunderstanding, but they were necessary. Each session chipped away at the walls that had long divided the town. One evening, Marcus received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, with no return address, but the handwriting was neat and deliberate. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "Chief Jordan, thank you for showing us what it means to lead with grace. You've given this town something it desperately needed: hope. Gratefully, a resident." Marcus stared at the letter for a long moment, his heart heavy with emotion. It was a reminder of why he had chosen this path, why he continued to fight for a town that was still learning to fight for itself. On a crisp Saturday morning, Marcus stood before the mural again, watching as a group of children played near its base. Their laughter echoed through the empty street, a sound that seemed to carry the promise of a better future. "Hey, Chief Jordan," a voice called. Marcus turned to see Mrs. Thompson, his neighbor, walking toward him with a basket of muffins. "Thought you might need one of these," she said, handing him a warm blueberry muffin. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Marcus said with a smile. "You didn't have to do that." She shrugged. "It's the least I can do. You've been working hard for this town, Marcus. We see it." Her words were simple, but deeply affirming. Marcus watched her walk away, the basket swinging at her side, and felt a surge of gratitude for the unexpected kindness that had come his way. That night, as Marcus sat on his porch, the town felt quieter, more peaceful. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the pavement, and the cool autumn breeze rustled the leaves. He thought about the progress Fairhaven had made and the challenges that still lay ahead. His father's words came back to him, a steady reminder of the lessons he had learned growing up. Strength isn't just in standing tall, it's in lifting others up. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a quiet determination settling over him. The road was still long, but Fairhaven was moving forward, one step at a time. And for now, that was enough. The chill of autumn deepened as October settled over Fairhaven, blanketing the town in rust-colored leaves and cool, crisp mornings. Marcus Jordan's days were filled with the usual demands of his job: routine patrols, department meetings, and the occasional neighborhood dispute. But beneath the surface of these ordinary tasks, the undercurrent of change was undeniable. The workshops had continued, gaining traction among residents, and even skeptics were beginning to take notice. Yet, Marcus knew the progress was fragile. Prejudice didn't disappear overnight, and the cracks that had begun to heal could just as easily reopen with one divisive moment. On a Friday afternoon, Marcus found himself back at the community center, preparing for the largest workshop yet. The turnout was expected to exceed capacity, and folding chairs were being arranged hastily by a few volunteers. Among them was Mrs. Keller, who had become an unlikely but invaluable supporter. "Do you think we'll need more chairs?" she asked, glancing at Marcus as she adjusted the neat rows. "We might," Marcus replied, giving her an appreciative nod. "This is the biggest response we've had so far." "That's a good sign." Mrs. Keller hesitated, then spoke in a quieter voice. "I have to admit, I didn't think things would change as much as they have. People are talking differently now. Even me." Her words carried a mixture of pride and vulnerability, and Marcus offered her a reassuring smile. "Change starts with conversations, and you've been part of making that happen," he said. "That's something to be proud of." She straightened slightly, her expression softening. "I suppose it is." As the workshop began, Marcus stood at the front of the room, scanning the faces of the nearly 100 attendees. Among them were familiar faces: Mrs. Thompson, Andre, Maria, and a few new ones, including Frank Simmons, the councilman who had been vocal about his reservations. Frank had positioned himself near the back, his arms crossed and his expression guarded. Marcus made a mental note to approach him later, curious about what had drawn him here. The session started with personal stories, each one raw and honest. A retired firefighter spoke about the prejudice he had faced as one of the first black recruits in the town's history. A young mother shared her fears of raising biracial children in a divided community. The stories were heavy, but they also carried notes of hope, moments of kindness that had shaped each person's journey. When it was Frank's turn to speak, the room grew quiet. He stood slowly, his large frame towering over the rows of chairs. His usual air of confidence was replaced with something more subdued. "I'll be honest," Frank began, his voice gruff. "I didn't think these workshops were a good idea. I thought they'd stir up trouble. But sitting here listening to all of you, well, it's made me think about some things." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "I grew up in Fairhaven, just like many of you. And I always thought I knew what this town stood for. But maybe I've been too focused on holding on to the past to see what we could be. I still don't have all the answers, but I want to be part of figuring it out." The crowd murmured in approval, and Marcus felt a flicker of surprise and hope. Frank's admission was unexpected, but it was a powerful moment of vulnerability from someone who had once resisted change. After the workshop, Marcus approached Frank as the room began to clear. "Thank you for speaking up," Marcus said. "That couldn't have been easy." Frank shrugged, his expression softening. "It wasn't," he admitted, "but it felt right. I've been stubborn, Chief. I see that now. You're doing good work here. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Marcus extended his hand, and Frank shook it firmly. "It's never too late to make a difference," Marcus said. "I appreciate you being here tonight." Frank nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'll be back for the next one," he said before walking out into the chilly night. The following days brought a new energy to Fairhaven. Frank's involvement seemed to inspire others who had been hesitant, and the workshops continued to grow in both size and impact. Marcus noticed more residents engaging in meaningful conversations, both at the events and in their everyday interactions. One afternoon, as Marcus walked through downtown, he saw a group of teenagers repainting a weathered bench near the library. Among them was Jamal, the boy who had invited Marcus to play basketball weeks earlier. "Hey, Chief Jordan," Jamal called, waving a paintbrush in the air. "What do you think?" Marcus smiled, walking over to inspect their work. The bench, once faded and splintered, was now a vibrant blue with the words "Fairhaven Strong" painted in bold, white letters across the backrest. "It looks great," Marcus said, his voice warm. "You're making this town better, one brushstroke at a time." Jamal beamed, his enthusiasm infectious. "We're going to do more benches next week. You should come help." "I just might," Marcus replied, chuckling. That evening, Marcus sat on his porch, the day's events replaying in his mind. He thought about Frank's words at the workshop, about Jamal and the mural, about Mrs. Keller's unexpected transformation. Each moment was a reminder that change was possible, even in the most unlikely places. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen to see a text from Irene Walsh. "Incredible work tonight. The town feels different thanks to you." Marcus smiled faintly, typing a quick reply. "It's not just me. It's all of us." He set the phone down, leaning back in his chair as the cool night air settled around him. Fairhaven wasn't perfect, there were still challenges ahead, and not everyone was ready to embrace the changes. But the town was growing, its roots deepening and its branches reaching towards something brighter. For Marcus, that was enough to keep going. The air was crisp as Fairhaven settled into late autumn. The streets were lined with golden leaves, and the town seemed to hum with an energy Marcus Jordan had not felt in years. The workshops had become a cornerstone of the community, drawing residents from all walks of life. Each session brought new voices, stories, and perspectives, weaving a tapestry of resilience and hope. Marcus stood in the town square one chilly morning, watching a group of volunteers hang banners for the first ever Fairhaven Together festival. The festival had been Irene Walsh's idea, a culmination of the town's efforts to foster unity and celebrate its growing diversity. It was scheduled for the following weekend, and excitement was building. Mrs. Keller bustled past, carrying a box of supplies. She paused when she saw Marcus, adjusting her scarf against the cold. "Morning, Chief," she said, her tone warmer than he had ever heard it. "Looks like we're finally getting somewhere." Marcus smiled, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Good morning, Mrs. Keller. We've come a long way, but there's still more work to do." She nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "You know," she said, "I used to think the way things were was good enough. But now, I see we could be so much more. Thank you for helping me understand that." Marcus placed a hand over his heart, moved by her sincerity. "Thank you for being willing to listen and grow. That's not easy." Mrs. Keller gave him a rare smile before continuing on her way, leaving Marcus to reflect on how far they had both come since their first encounter at the farmer's market. Later that day, Marcus walked through the station, reviewing preparations for the festival. Carla Mendoza, his dependable deputy, met him in the hallway, holding a clipboard. "Chief, we've got everything lined up for security at the festival," Carla said. "We'll have officers at each entry point and a few patrolling the grounds. I think it's going to be a great day." "Thanks, Carla," Marcus said. "I appreciate the extra effort. This festival means a lot to the town." Carla hesitated, then added, "It means a lot to me, too. I grew up here, and I've never seen people come together like this before. It feels different, you know?" Marcus nodded, understanding her sentiment. "It does, and it's because people like you are willing to make it happen." As the week progressed, excitement for the festival grew. Local businesses donated food and decorations. Teenagers volunteered to help with setup, and families made plans to attend. Even skeptics like Frank Simmons were pitching in, his brusque manner softened by his newfound willingness to embrace change. On the eve of the festival, Marcus found himself back at the community center for one final workshop. The turnout was larger than ever, the room buzzing with anticipation. Marcus stood at the front, his presence commanding but approachable. "Tomorrow we celebrate how far we've come as a town," he began, his voice steady. "But tonight I want to take a moment to reflect on what brought us here. It's not just the workshops or the events. It's the courage of every person in this room who chose to speak up, to listen, and to grow." He paused, letting his words settle. "Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But step by step, we're building something better for ourselves, for our neighbors, and for the generations to come." The room erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude. It wasn't just his journey anymore, it was the town's. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the festival early, the air alive with the sounds of vendors setting up and children laughing as they chased each other around the square. The banners fluttered in the breeze, and the smell of freshly baked goods wafted through the air. As the day unfolded, Marcus walked among the crowd, greeting residents and soaking in the festive atmosphere. He stopped by a booth run by Andre, who was selling prints of the mural he had helped paint. "Chief Jordan," Andre called, grinning widely. "You've got to see this." He handed Marcus a framed print of the mural, the vibrant tree standing tall with its message of unity. Beneath it, Andre had added an inscription, "For Chief Jordan, who planted the first seed." Marcus's chest tightened with emotion. "Thank you, Andre," he said, his voice thick. "This means more to me than you know." Andre beamed, and Marcus placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, silently vowing to continue supporting him and others like him. As the sun began to set, the festival culminated in a community dinner beneath strings of twinkling lights. Long tables were set up in the square, and people sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing stories and laughter. Marcus found himself seated next to Mrs. Keller, who had brought her famous apple pie. "You should try a slice," she said, nudging the plate toward him. "It's the least I can do for all you've done for this town." Marcus chuckled, accepting the slice. "If it's anything like the progress we've made, I'm sure it's excellent." Mrs. Keller smiled, and for the first time, Marcus saw not the woman who had once told him he didn't belong, but a neighbor, a friend, and an ally. As the evening wound down, Marcus stood at the edge of the square, watching the glow of the lights and the warmth of the people gathered beneath them. He thought about his parents, about their sacrifices and the lessons they had taught him. He thought about the mural, the workshops, and the festival that had brought the town together. Fairhaven wasn't perfect, but it was growing. And as Marcus looked out over the crowd, he knew that together, they were building something worth fighting for. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace. The glow of the festival lingered in Fairhaven long after the lights had been taken down and the booths packed away. The air seemed lighter, conversations warmer, and the barriers that once divided the town had started to fade. Marcus Jordan felt the shift in the community with every patrol, every meeting, and every greeting exchanged on the streets. But progress, Marcus knew, rarely came without resistance. Change stirred both hope and discomfort, and while many in Fairhaven embraced the new sense of unity, others found it harder to let go of the past. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon when Marcus first felt the undercurrent of unease. He was walking to his car after a meeting with Irene Walsh, discussing plans to continue the workshops into the winter. The town square was quieter than usual, the buzz of the festival replaced by the subdued rhythm of daily life. As Marcus approached his car, he noticed a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. At first, he thought it was a flyer, but as he pulled it free, his chest tightened. The paper was a crude drawing a stick figure in a police uniform with a noose around its neck. Beneath it, a single word was scrawled in jagged letters, "Leave." Marcus stared at the note, the weight of its message settling over him like a cold shadow. He had faced threats before, both as a black man and as a police officer, but this felt different. It wasn't just an attack on him, it was an attack on the progress Fairhaven had made. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. His mind was calm, his resolve steady, but the memory of his father's voice whispered in his ears. Strength isn't about what happens to you. It's about how you choose to respond. Marcus chose not to share the note immediately. Instead, he focused on his work, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had earned him the respect of so many in Fairhaven. But inside, the note weighed on him, a reminder that the journey toward change was far from over. That evening, as he sat in his living room, he found himself staring at the framed photograph of his parents on the mantel. His father's steady gaze and his mother's warm smile seemed to offer silent encouragement. Marcus picked up his phone and called Carla. "Deputy Mendoza," he said when she answered. "I need to talk to you about something. Can you meet me at the station?" An hour later, Marcus sat across from Carla in the station's small conference room. He handed her the folded note, watching as her face hardened while she read it. "Chief," she said, her voice laced with anger, "this is a threat. We need to treat it seriously." "I know," Marcus replied, his tone calm, "but I don't want this to overshadow the progress we've made. This isn't about me, it's about the town." Carla hesitated, then nodded. "I understand, but we can't ignore it. I'll start looking into it discreetly. And Chief, be careful." "I always am," Marcus said, offering her a small smile. The following days were uneventful, but Marcus remained vigilant. He continued his patrols, attended community events, and engaged with residents as he always had. Yet, the note lingered in his mind, a reminder of the challenges that still lay ahead. One afternoon, as he walked through the farmer's market, he saw Mrs. Keller standing by a stall of baked goods. She waved him over, her expression warm. "Chief Jordan," she said, handing him a small loaf of pumpkin bread. "This is for you. A little thank you for everything you've done." "Thank you, Mrs. Keller," Marcus said, genuinely touched. "You didn't have to do this." "Nonsense," she replied. "You've changed this town, and you've changed me. The least I can do is show my appreciation." Her kindness reminded Marcus of why he continued to fight for Fairhaven. For every act of resistance, there were moments like this, small, genuine gestures that proved change was possible. That evening, Marcus received an unexpected visit. He had just finished dinner when there was a knock at his door. Opening it, he found Frank Simmons standing on the porch, his expression serious. "Councilman Simmons," Marcus said, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you here?" Frank hesitated, then held up a folded piece of paper. "I found this on my car this morning," he said, handing it to Marcus. Unfolding the note, Marcus felt a chill. It was nearly identical to the one he had received. Another stick figure, another noose, another message. Stop. Do you think this is connected to the workshops? Frank asked, his voice low. Marcus nodded slowly. It's possible. Change makes some people uncomfortable, and fear can make them act out. Frank sat down heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. I never thought. I've lived here my whole life. This isn't who we are. It's not who most of us are, Marcus said firmly. But that's why we have to keep going. We can't let fear or hate undo what we've built. Frank looked up, his expression resolute. You're right, Chief. What can I do to help? The next day, Marcus and Frank met with Irene Walsh to discuss the notes. They decided to address the issue openly, using it as an opportunity to reaffirm the town's commitment to unity. At the next workshop, Marcus shared his story, holding up the note as he spoke. This is a reminder, he said, his voice steady, that change isn't easy. But it's also a reminder of why we can't stop. Fairhaven is worth fighting for, and so are the people who call it home. The crowd responded with applause, their support a powerful antidote to the hate that had tried to creep in. That evening, as Marcus walked home, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would still be difficult, but Fairhaven was stronger than it had been before. And as long as he had the support of the community, Marcus knew they could weather any storm. Looking up at the stars, Marcus thought of his father's words once more. Strength isn't about what happens to you. It's about how you choose to respond. And Marcus chose hope. The days following the revelation of the threats were a turning point for Fairhaven. Marcus Jordan's decision to address the hateful notes openly had sparked something remarkable, a collective refusal to be silenced. The workshops became even more popular, as residents flocked to show their support and continue the dialogue Marcus had worked so hard to foster. On a brisk Saturday morning, Marcus stood outside the community center, watching as volunteers carried tables, chairs, and supplies inside for another event. It was the first in a new series of workshops focused on collaboration between neighborhoods that had long been divided. Mrs. Keller arrived with a basket of her famous apple pies, her movements quick and purposeful. She spotted Marcus and approached him, a look of determination on her face. Chief Jordan, she said, adjusting her scarf against the chill. I've been thinking. Those notes, they were meant to scare us, to make us stop. But look at what's happening now. People are coming together more than ever. Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's the thing about fear, it loses its power when we face it head on. Mrs. Keller placed a hand on his arm, her gaze steady. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm proud of what we're building here. And I'm proud to know you. Her words warmed Marcus more than he could express, and he gave her a small smile. Thank you, Mrs. Keller. That means a lot. The workshop that day was the largest yet, with attendees spilling into the hallway when the chairs ran out. Marcus stood at the front, scanning the crowd with quiet pride. The room was filled with faces he recognized: Andre, Frank Simmons, Carla, Maria, Jamal, and many more he didn't. He began by thanking everyone for their courage and commitment. What we're doing here isn't just about today, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. It's about building a foundation for tomorrow. It's about making sure Fairhaven is a place where everyone feels they belong. As he spoke, Marcus noticed a young boy sitting near the back, no older than 10, listening intently. The boy's eyes were wide, his expression serious. Marcus couldn't help but think of himself at that age, sitting on his father's lap as he explained the importance of standing up for what was right. After the workshop ended, Marcus made his way to the boy and his family. The boy looked up at him, awe shining in his eyes. Hi there, Marcus said, crouching to the boy's level. What's your name? Caleb, the boy said shyly. Nice to meet you, Caleb, Marcus replied. Did you enjoy the workshop? Caleb nodded, then hesitated. I want to help people like you do. Marcus's heart swelled at the boy's words. He placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. You could, Caleb. It starts with kindness and courage. And it sounds like you've already got both. Caleb beamed, and his parents thanked Marcus before they left. That evening, Marcus returned home, the day's events playing over in his mind. He sat on his porch, a mug of tea in his hands, as the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. The quiet of the night was a stark contrast to the energy of the workshop, but it gave Marcus a chance to reflect. Fairhaven had come a long way, but the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, moments of doubt, and resistance to change. But Marcus believed in the town's ability to grow, to heal, and to thrive. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on his driveway. He looked up to see Andre approaching, holding a framed version of the mural print he had given Marcus weeks ago. "Chief Jordan," Andre said, his voice steady but emotional. "I wanted to bring this to you. The mural means a lot to me, and I realized it's because you inspired it. You gave us hope." Marcus accepted the frame, his eyes scanning the familiar image. The tree stood tall, its roots deep, its branches strong. Beneath it were the words Andre had added, "For Chief Jordan, who planted the first seed." "Thank you, Andre," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." Andre smiled, then turned to leave, his steps lighter than when he had arrived. As Marcus sat alone with the mural, he thought about how far he had come since that fateful day at the farmer's market. The note tucked under his windshield, the hateful words he had endured, and the difficult conversations he had navigated, all of it had led to this moment. Fairhaven wasn't perfect, but it was stronger, more united, and more determined to build a better future. Marcus placed the mural print on the mantel beside the photograph of his parents. The two images together felt like a bridge between past and present, a reminder of the strength and love that had shaped him and the community he now served. As the night deepened, Marcus leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile on his face. Fairhaven still had its challenges, but hope had taken root. And as long as that hope endured, Marcus knew they could face anything together. As the stars shimmered over Fairhaven, a sense of calm settled over the town. The journey wasn't over, but the seeds of change had been planted, nurtured by courage, kindness, and resilience. Marcus Jordan's unwavering commitment to unity had sparked a movement that would inspire generations to come. This story reminds us all that even in the face of division and hate, hope can take root and grow, one step, one act of kindness, and one conversation at a time. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of perseverance, hope, and the power of community. Together, we can create a brighter future, one story at a time.